name's Carlton and I'm 20 years old. I just briefly want to share the story of how I became a Christian. So as I was growing up, my brother and I didn't really have a particularly religious upbringing. Neither of my parents are religious. So we never really had any kind of instruction from them. We learned like basic morality and stuff like that, but there wasn't any kind of religious ideas that were put forth to us. All we used to do was go to Sunday school, and even when we were there, we only went for like the games and the competitions and things like that. We didn't go out of a desire to know God or to understand who God was. But somehow religion was something that always interested me, and so I would always be reading about different religions. I was fascinated by different religious rituals and ceremonies, I guess. And so it was as I grew up, I became kind of able to look into these things properly. So I would go to different places. I would go to like the mosque, to synagogues, all these things, to try and understand who God was, or to attain that truth that people seem to have. But it was so confusing for me because obviously everyone was saying something different, and so I was really confused as to who was right. And so I figured that what I'd have to do was kind of try or sample everything and then come to a conclusion at the end. So I remember there was a period of time where I would have different Bible studies, with Jehovah's Witnesses or Mormons or all these different groups, and just try and understand. Obviously, the more I would hear these different theories, the more confused I became. And as much as I was learning more and more, my behaviour wasn't changing, and me as a person was probably getting worse. At this time, I was at secondary school, and I was going out with people that were a lot older than I was, and so it's like through the week I'd be having these different Bible studies with all these people, and then it was like come the weekend we'd go out, we'd drink and all these different things. So even though I was learning more and intellectually I was advancing, I think who I was a person, I wasn't being transformed by anything that I was learning. I remember there was a time when I met a man who was basically squatting in a park. He was living there, and he was talking to me and my friends about different things like the book of Revelation. Even though he had an incorrect view, a view that really didn't make much sense to me at the time, there were certain things that he'd mentioned that I'd see come, there were things that were happening around the world, like earthquakes and tsunamis and floods. And so it was obvious that the things that he was talking about, the idea that the world was coming to an end, it was obvious that he was right when he was speaking about that. And it's like, the more he spoke to us, the more kind of afraid I became. Because I realised that if the Bible was correct about the end of the world, it would also be right about, all the other things like, heaven and hell and the fact that we'd be judged. So that really scared me. And so I guess that was the catalyst for wanting to become different. So I remember one time praying and asking God, obviously being so confused, having heard all these different theories about how to become, how to kind of please God, how to be saved, if you like. Having heard so many different theories and stories, I kind of just said to God, if you are real, I need you to help me. And he did. And so I remember, that night, something just felt different. So I remember I just looked up the nearest church, and I started to go there. And God was helping me, I was learning, and I could see myself changing slowly. It was when I was in year 11 at school that I'd been going to church for about 2 or 3 years. And as much as I was kind of learning and I'd call myself a Christian, there were still certain things that I was involved in. There were things that I was doing that I knew that God wasn't really pleased about, but I couldn't find a way to stop. Being involved in relationships that I knew God wouldn't be happy with, just the way I spent my time, all these things I knew weren't acceptable to God, but I didn't know how to change them or how to be transformed completely. And so it was kind of like a cycle where I'd try so much in my own strength to try and stop things. I'd go so many days without doing this, and then I'd fall and I'd kind of condemn myself, and it was kind of like that. So even though I might have been a Christian, and I understood intellectually what it meant to be loved by God and all those things. I hadn't really experienced that power myself. It was when I was in year 11 at school. I had a teacher who was a Seventh-day Adventist, and she found out I was a Christian, and so we began to talk just about different topics. And so at the time she was telling me basically about the issue of the Sabbath. We had Bible studies and stuff. It was like, as much as she would tell me and show it to me from the scriptures, I would ask people in my other church, and they would kind of just give me an explanation, and I'd be happy with that, not really knowing how to argue against it or how to adequately show what I'd been shown. And over time, I was still kind of in this circle of being kind of half in church, half in the world. That was who I was, and that was my experience. I remember being given a copy of a book called The Great Controversy in Birmingham City Centre. I was handed that book, and I remember reading that book and just being so fascinated, because it presented a totally different view of how the world would come to an end, and it was a view that I'd never heard before, and it was something that stood out in my mind. And it was just like contemplating that and thinking about those things, and still being unhappy in my Christian experience, or what I believe to be my experience or my walk with God. And things basically came to a head around last year. There were just different things going on in church, the church I was a part of, and I kind of knew that it was time for me to leave. And so there was a period of time when I wasn't going to any church. It was just by kind of coincidence that there was a Seventh-day Adventist lady in my office at work, and we began to talk, and she began to give me the same books I'd been given before, and it was almost like I could feel like God was saying, you need to investigate this properly. So I remember going to a Seventh-day Adventist church, beginning to have Bible studies and really seeing God in a way that I'd never seen him before. So many of the things that I'd heard, for example, God would send me to hell and I'd burn forever. Things that I'd heard that didn't seem... I found it hard to accept that that's who God was, and so these views of God were beginning to be corrected. And in learning seeing God differently, my experience changed. I seem to now be able to access that power to change my life, and instead of living kind of half in the world, half in church, or being like a part-time Christian, I was able to live by his grace a life that is acceptable to him. And so I came into the church in May. I got baptised in August, and since that time, it's almost been a year, and since that time so many different things have changed. I just feel better in myself. I have victory over things that I was really, really struggling with. Things that I thought I'd never be able to stop doing or not be involved in anymore. God has really helped me to not, stop those things. And just my experience, the way that he's leading me to meet different people and to share the truth with them. But one of the biggest things that God's done is in my family. Like I said earlier, my parents are atheists. I don't really have any religious inclinations, but I remember at my baptism, my parents were both there, and they were both affected by the message that they heard, and their view of Christianity has changed, and I really, really believe that the time will come where they too do what I've done and give my life to God. So I guess I just want to encourage you, first of all, to know God for yourself, to not listen to the different theories that you'd hear surrounding God, but to take time out for yourself to study it. Because as you would study God, as you would get to know him for yourself, more than just giving you information, he'll actually do something in your life. And if you are in the position where I was in, where it's like you're kind of half a Christian, you say you believe, but your life doesn't match up, I just want to encourage you to give yourself entirely to God, because as you do that, he can open doors, he can do things with you that you'd never expect him to. So yeah.